I am your host for the day. I'm Anne Choquette, CEO of TheLi.st. TheLi.st is a community of high impact women and underrepresented leaders who are devoted to helping each other achieve and succeed. And so today, I am thrilled to help lister Vanessa Bennett launch This Is So Awkward. This we would all like to see on the New York Times bestseller list. And so I will pop it into the chat so that you can all buy a copy of the book. This is my job. I will be your barker for the day. And I'm going to let Vanessa and her co-writer and co-podcast host, Cara Natterson, take it away with the amazing help of Abelioniema, who was our community guru and who has stepped into her full-time role as a Gen Z relationship expert. I am going to dip out, but I will see you all in the chat. And Abella, I'll let you take it away.
Hi, everyone. I am thrilled to be having this conversation. It's a reciprocal relationship because I got to be interviewed by Vanessa and Cara on their podcast, the Puberty podcast, and now I get to talk to them today and be in conversation about this fantastic book. This is so awkward. And so just by way of quick introduction of these two incredible women, Vanessa Bennett is a puberty educator and writer. Cara Natterson is a pediatrician and New York Times bestselling author. Together, they wrote, as I said, This Is So Awkward, but they also co-host the Puberty podcast and run Order of Magnitude, which is a leading brand dedicated to flipping puberty positive. And if you have read this, if you are yet to read it, when you do read it, you will see that this book walks that talk, in that it just makes puberty and what happens in your tween and teen years so accessible and so just normal. You normalize everything so beautifully, the two of you. So I'm really excited to be talking to you. Maybe one of the biggest bona fides that they have is that between them, they parent 16 human beings, and they're all still alive. So I think that you're probably doing a decent job. You're still alive, actually, is probably the biggest testament to that. So really, really excited to have this conversation. Just so we know who's in the room, by way of emoji, will you give me a little emoji reaction if you are parenting currently a tween or a teen? If you are able to do that on your, okay. Yep. Okay, nice. Now, an emoji if you are not parenting a teen or tween, but maybe someone younger. Let's see who we have in this room. Someone younger. Got it. Okay, it's good to know who we have in the room. And then just give us an emoji if you're just here because you love Vanessa and you want to support her and you're excited to meet Cara because she's the best. They're both the best.
I don't see any. Oh, good. There's a little. I was like, no one is going to put an emoji.
Who's going to put one, Vanessa?
Give an emoji for the two of them. All right. Well, I'm going to give you guys something in return. Oh, can I share? Oh, no, I don't want to share screen. I just want to get into the chat. I'm so used to. Where is the chat?
On the bottom. Oh, I put your episode with us in the chat.
I got it.
So people can listen to
it.
All
right.
Amazing.
So in order to help you, this book is so full of information that I went ahead and put in the chat all the different chapter topics so that you will know as things come up for you, as we're talking, as you're thinking about your own lives, the kids that you might parent or care about. These are all the different things that This Is So Awkward covers. And I was joking to Vanessa and Cara beforehand. I was like, oh yeah, hair, that's part of puberty, or okay, sleep, right? So like we think there's kind of like these major topics, but then there's all these other topics that are under it too, including friendship, which I think is really unusual. You don't often see friendship covered in a book about puberty, and yet this age group and friendship is so important. So as you are thinking about questions, hopefully that's just a little cheat sheet helper to jog your memory. All right, so now I'm going to ask my questions. There are 44 million kids in the US, Vanessa and Cara, 1.4 billion around the globe. are going through puberty currently, right now. Heaven help us. What has changed physically, socially, emotionally about puberty these days?
Yeah, I can start. So the 44 million number, here's the math behind it. There are 4 million kids born every year in this country, and puberty now lasts a decade. So if you count years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that actually gives you a multiple of 11. That gets you to 44 million who are in it. And then extended across the globe, because of course, every single human being will go through puberty. And this is one sort of important side note, is not a gendered phenomenon. I think people often think puberty and girls. This is far from it, puberty and human. The data started shifting in the mid to late 1990s. Before then, we knew that puberty happened on average starting at 11 for genetic females and starting at 11 and a half for males. That data was collected post World War II and is really true. It was true globally, with the exception of certain areas in South and Central America. But what we saw then by the 90s was that the average age of onset had shifted downward. Now, there's a very wide range of entering puberty. So there are very young kids who enter historically well before 11 or 11 and a half. There are late bloomers who come to it much later than that, but we're looking at the average. So in 1997, the average had moved down to age 10 for girls. By 2010, the average had moved down to between 8 and 9. And there were very clear differences between different racial groups. Only 3 groups were actually looked at as specific cohorts, one being Black girls, one being Caucasian or white girls, one being Latina or Hispanic girls. But Black girls were first to puberty, was very clear. And then by 2012, we knew that boys too were close to puberty or earlier to puberty. It was just that no one had studied them. They were really missed in the data. And so average age for them, established more than a decade ago, was between the ages of 9 and 10. So that's where the math changes, Abella, and that's why we have these massive numbers. I'll just add one other detail, which is it's not going faster. It's actually going slower. So for us, most of us entered puberty sometime around age 11.
And Cara, what does enter puberty mean?
Yeah, so it means that our hormones started to surge, which physically looks like breast budding, but honestly is really emotional before it's even physical. So our friend Louise Greenspan, who writes a lot of these studies, she's the brains behind a lot of the early puberty data, she will say that the first sign of puberty is a slamming door. I think that's about the best description ever. For boys, it's penile and testicular growth, harder to see. And so that's what it means. But I just want to add that Louise also did studies looking at first period. First period is a middle marker of puberty. And what we now know is that the first period has really not moved up a lot earlier. It's pushed up by about 3 months as opposed to 3 years for that breast budding and mood swing.
Wow. And I thank you for even saying that the period is a middle marker. I think most people, the assumption is the period is the start of puberty.
Yeah, I mean, so puberty doesn't begin and end with the period, and then there's a whole other half of the population who will not become menstruators ever. It's so interesting how many people, when you tell them you're writing a book about puberty, assume it's a book about girls, which tells you so much about what you need to know about conversations about puberty and adolescence in this country.
Right, well,
it's so
in
gendered.
the book, you cover penis size, erection, masturbation, all of that, right? And so what should we be thinking about when we're thinking about boys in puberty?
So the first thing we should be thinking about is that all kids of all genders deserve the full universe of conversations, information about their growing and changing bodies and their growing social and emotional reality. So like boy puberty is a punchline in our society, right? It's like boners and wet dreams and masturbation, and it's like all a joke. And there's not a lot of room for boys, like emotional reality and relationship reality, which is your wheelhouse, right? Is helping people who are told by everybody, oh, like, you know, it's just about getting laid and like notches on the door, on the bedpost, but really boys have like really deep emotional, respectful desire for love and connection and all of that. So we need to include that in the boy conversations. Even though in our ideal world, all these conversations are had with people of all genders by adults of all genders. And for people who are going through female puberty, it's like the whole world is telling them it sucks. It's such a drag. It's like, what a bummer to menstruate for their, and really like they should get to laugh and make jokes about it and be joyful about it and all of that. So like one of our biggest goals is to get everybody involved in like the whole range of all of these conversations, like the earnest and the joyful and the funny, and the conversations about deep connection, because we want all people to have that full experience.
Yeah, and I'm really mindful of the language you're using, and how do you navigate, or how does a parent or someone who cares about young people navigate gender identity when puberty in and of itself is so binary, right? We're talking about, well, this is what happens to boys during puberty, this is what happens to girls. How are we then to be talking to our young people in a way that is like expansive and provides room for their gender exploration, and how that might be today versus how that may be in the future?
Yeah.
Their peers, gender expression, how do we navigate that and create space?
It starts by teaching everyone about everyone's bodies, right? I mean, why do we silo these classes by gender? That's insanity. It doesn't matter if you have ovaries or testicles, you should understand how ovaries and testicles work. It's like, it's very basic. And by siloing them, what we've done is we've made conversations around it secret and private and shameful. This is not to say that there isn't a space for people who share anatomy or share gender identity to come together, but the basis of the information, that the sort of foundational information, should not stop with the parts you have. And we feel so strongly about this that not only do we write about it in the book, and Vanessa can talk a little bit more about how we write about it and what we have to say about it, but we are in the process of launching a health and sex ed curriculum for all. And one of the goals, I mean, part of it is to make this information more relatable and reliable in schools and in homes, but also another piece of it is to be able to address this, like how the teachers who are teaching are not armed with the comfort of teaching about anatomy they don't have. That's how they were taught. So how do we help embolden teachers in classrooms to actually see this as science and fact and information that's going to keep everyone safe?
Yeah, I mean, we're both cis hetero women. And so when we wrote about gender identity and we spoke to experts and we did our research, we relied on folks who
Where on my monthly bill? Oh, right. Okay.
This is the space we rely on, folks who this is their expertise. And I will be honest, it was the scariest chapter to write, because when we wrote about gender identity, we say this in the opening paragraph, even the very language we use in that chapter may be out of date within a few months of having published the book. And so we very explicitly shared our intention, partially the intention of separating out gender identity and sexual orientation as two separate chapters. That was a very deliberate decision, because they are two separate things in a kid's developing, burgeoning identity. And we relied on sensitivity reading and research and expertise from other folks. But the biggest thing that we come down with in the chapter is like, it's just about being inclusive and open-ended. And that's actually true of like everything, because adults are so eager to know, like if a kid is exploring their gender identity or their sexual orientation, adults often inadvertently put a lot of pressure on kids to like choose and decide and know. And so a lot of the experts that we spoke to were like, no, like what, let them go through their journey. Kids of all different identities go through all different kinds of journeys. Create a safe space for them to explore their pathway and figure it out. Don't try to force them to pin themselves down in one way or another. And so it's really about building inclusive homes and environments, which gives kids the sense that they are safe to like explore and figure it out and be in conversation or not be in conversation sometimes. So that was a big part of it. The other thing, when we think about inclusivity, and we did a podcast episode, is like people talk about, oh, well, people with ovaries or people with this, but there are a lot of people who identify as female, who appear to the world as female, but weren't born with ovaries or weren't born with uteruses or weren't born. So even when we try to have inclusive language, there's a certain medical condition called MRKH. And we had a young woman on the podcast and she's like, I don't menstruate. I don't have a uterus. And so like, there's language that gets used that doesn't feel inclusive to me. And I think we're constantly being taught, particularly by the kids, because each chapter of the book is an essay by a kid at the end of it, someone between 18 and 22. Annabella, you know this. Kids are our best teachers. So even when we think we're being inclusive, we'll turn around and have a kid be like, no, you missed me, or like, you're not representing my story. And so that was a big part of kind of making sure we were doing the best we could to represent different, experiences and viewpoints.
Yes. Well, one of the things that you said that I think aligns with some of the tips that you give parents is that you're going to make mistakes and you can course correct, you can correct. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe just a top 3 tips to give a parent in entering into conversations about puberty. And also just kind of like, when should we start? So we know that we have a lot of people in this room who are in a household with a teen or a tween. Some are parenting younger. Like, when should this start and what are some tips?
Right. Well, I'll go with the when to start, and I'll give you my favorite tip and then pass the baton to Vanessa. It's never too early to start, and it's never too late. So for people with young kids, when we say start, you start with having conversations about naming body parts. It turns out that kids who know their body parts are far less likely to be the victims of a predator, because that predator knows that an adult is talking to that kid and they don't want to waste their time grooming a kid who has a safe adult to talk to. So they should know their body parts. Talking about consent, and consent, I mean, Abella is sort of the consent guru that I think of. So I'd be happy for you to chime in. But for us, consent begins with conversations that have nothing to do with sex. They have to do with sharing space, sharing can I take a bite of your sandwich? Can I braid your hair? Can I sit on your lap? Learning the very fundamental aspects of consent, then allow the conversations about consent when it comes to sex to be easier. They're not such a big leap, right? You don't have to connect all these dots. You can just start labeling these as consent conversations. So that's on the very early end. But I want to reassure people who have kids who are older, if you haven't started these conversations yet, fine, no big deal, because this is not one talk. This is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of talks over time. And even if you have an older teenager, you can begin now. And this is a very easy lead into my first piece of advice, my favorite, which is take the do-over. When you mess up, and we all do, Vanessa and I mess up every single day, and we do this for a living. When you mess up, take the do-over with your kid or the kid in your life and say, gosh, I never talked to you about this. But I was on the Zoom and it got me thinking, I want to take the do-over and I'm going to start now. And you can always give them the why, the rationale behind why you're doing something. Sometimes it's obvious. You get really mad at a kid in your life, you scream at them, you turn around and you say, I need to take the do-over. I shouldn't have screamed. You don't have to explain much more than that. But when it comes to missing an opportunity or realizing that you might have missed an opportunity, tell them that's the why. Hey, when I grew up, we never talked about this stuff. I'm realizing that today things are different. I'm so glad. I'm going to take a do-over and start talking about this stuff with you.
Yeah.
And I would just add, it's like we grew up with like the talk, and this is actually thousands of tiny conversations. Like when people think about talking to kids about their bodies or relationships or sex or safety, it's like they think they have to like back up the dump truck and just like let all their shit slide onto their kids. And like the kids basically are like drowning in the garbage. And instead, it's literally like 2 sentences here, 3 sentences there. It's like on the walk to get the mail. It is on the car ride to go get milk. It is like tiny conversations because they don't have the capacity to ingest tons and tons of information. And the other benefit of doing little conversations is when you screw up, you haven't screwed up this whole universe. You've just screwed up this tiny little corner of the universe. And it's much easier to take a do-over when you just have like one piece to correct. The other thing that we really like to encourage people to do is just kind of narrate how they're feeling, right? Like, oh God, my pits are so sweaty. I'm so nervous. I feel like I'm going to throw up a little bit because I'm so stressed about talking to you about porn, but like, we have to talk about it. And so I'm going to get over my discomfort because this is so important that I'm going to like sit here, and I know it'll get a little easier when we start talking. And that shows kids 2 things. One, that we can have uncomfortable experiences and move past them. And 2, that talking about this stuff is so important that we are willing to withstand the like incredible discomfort of it because we care about it so much. And then we hope in turn they will recognize the importance of those things and go on and put those into practice in their own lives.
Yeah, it really humanizes a parent in a way that I don't think kids realize that their parents are human. Can you give us some tips? Like you have in the book some great conversation starters. So we're kind of like talking amorphously about like it's never too late, it's never too early. But like what are the words that should come out of your mouth to broach to start the conversation?
I mean, it's so interesting because kids can sniff out inauthentic adults like a mile away, 10 miles away. So the most important thing is just to like remember to be yourself, and to remember to be inclusive. So many of us grew up in like deeply heteronormative worlds and realities and households and communities. So let's say you're like, I'm going to have the sex conversation. I want to have the sex conversation. Great. So if you're going to have the sex conversation, the first thing you have to recognize is there's not one kind of sex, right? We were raised with sex equals penis in vagina intercourse, but there's like tons of different ways people have sex. And so we have to be inclusive because we don't know where our kids are going to end up and who and how they're going to choose to have sex. So, a perfect example would be like if you haven't started using anatomically correct terms, this is the time to start introducing words like penis and vagina and vulva and breasts. Even if you use other words like boobs and I don't know. I don't know most adults who use the word dick with their kids, but it's entirely possible that some people do. Mostly I just use it when my kids are being assholes and I'm like, don't be a dick. But I guess other people, or wet dreams or boners, you want to make sure they know the scientific term and then you can get down with their lingo. And then you want to be like, hey, there are lots of different ways people have sex. It often involves genitals. Genitals are things like vaginas and penises and vulvas, but also people use their mouths and their breasts. In the book, we talk about how there are 4 kinds of sex: vaginal and penile intercourse, anal sex, oral sex, and sex with yourself. And one of the most common questions we're getting on the road is actually about masturbation. And people are very interested in hearing us give advice about masturbation. So Abella, if I was going to sit down with a 12-year-old and I've decided to have the masturbation talk, I want to make sure, again, they know what a clitoris is, right? Like people don't tell people with clitorises that they have clitorises, and clitorises' only job is that it feels good when it's touched. So make sure you have that. And then you can say, hey, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but it's really nice that parts of your body feel really good when they're touched. And it's great to know and understand your body, and what feels good. And, we'll come up with, because often people talk about their kids being in public spaces in their house, masturbating or touching themselves, and they don't know how to set parameters without shaming. So like this might be an opportunity to have that. Cara, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, Vanessa is the tree person and I am the forest person, which is why I always go broad strokes. And Vanessa is really amazing at giving specific examples. When it comes to language, it's a lot of trees. It's going to be each type of conversation is going to require different language. And depending upon your personality and temperament, the kid's personality and temperament, who else is there when you're trying to have the conversation, what the other precipitating factors are that are going on. Was there something that prompted a question or a concern? All these other, each conversation is going to be different. And so it's such an important question that you ask, but really we want to give people permission to do it their own way. And one of the biggest pieces of advice we give is no shame or judgment. And that goes for conversations with kids, but it also goes for feelings about how other adults do it with other kids. Like the way adults talk to kids in other homes, Vanessa and we have totally different approaches with our kids. We don't judge each other. There's nothing negative. We learn from each other when there are ways through. Sometimes Vanessa is amazing at threading a needle that I've not figured out how to thread. And I take that inspiration from her. But like my language and her language are so different. And being sort of understanding that there are lots of different ways through gives you as the adult permission to try different ways through and to see what works for the particular kid. Spoiler alert, if there's more than one kid in your life, once you have it figured out with one of them, you got to refigure it out with the other, because no two kids are alike. Even identical twins, no two kids are alike.
Yeah. I want to get into some of the questions in the room, but I also want to do just at least one question about one of the topics, something that you said has been coming up a lot. So Vanessa and Cara have been on a amazing road show. You may have seen them on Good Morning America, on Drew Barrymore. They have been in schools across both coasts, talking to parents and educators, all about the incredible information that's in this book. And one of the things that you both said that has been coming up a lot is sex, hookup culture, and pornography. And so in the book, you'll see, and maybe people have heard this before, that for a sizable percentage of of young people, age 10 is typically, it can be the age of first viewing of pornography, whether not necessarily intentionally, but because they have an older person in their life that was like, oh, come here, let me show you this, or because they typed something in and saw something that maybe they weren't necessarily looking for. And so I'm curious how we who care about young people navigate even beginning to wrap our mind about talking to porn with a 10-year-old or an 8 or 9-year-old, because you want to get ahead of the game, or at any age, how are we having these conversations?
So let me give you a little data and then Vanessa can get into conversation. 50% of all 12-year-olds in this country have seen porn. That's the data. 15% of all 10-year-olds.
But not my kid.
Not my kid. We had one parent say,
kid.
We had a parent literally raise their hand at a talk and say, but I have a nice kid.
Yeah.
And we wanted to just cry on the spot, because like nice doesn't protect them against porn. It finds them. They are often not looking for it. It is one click away on all sorts of social media platforms. And don't kid yourself, that includes YouTube, that includes Discord, right? So like these platforms that we rationalize are okay for younger kids, everything's just a click. But this is important because it's writing the narrative. I mean, again, Avila, I feel like such a charlatan speaking in your wheelhouse here, but you can tell me if I'm saying it okay. Pornographers are writing the narrative of sex for kids who have never even kissed someone. And so that is why we need to talk about it with younger kids. And it feels overwhelming, and we understand it feels overwhelming, but if you don't start having these conversations with kids of all ages, but certainly starting by about age 10 or 11, we say 10, then you're just outsourcing the conversation to someone else, and that someone else is a pornographer. So Vanessa, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, and also this is not the like feminist ethical porn behind paywalls. This is like violent, non-consensual, aggressive porn that is often confusing, frightening, and at least sort of like disturbing to a kid who again has like never seen a person's naked body besides maybe their family members and has never engaged in any kind of intimate behavior. So for porn, the starter conversation again goes back to, if you haven't had the sex talk, the initial basic fundamental sex talk, you got to have that before you can have the porn conversation. And then the porn conversation literally starts with, hey, you ever heard the word porn or pornography? And a kid will be like, oh, yes. You're like, oh, okay. Well, what does it mean? And they're like, I don't know, but they feel like they're supposed to know because the word is out there. And yes, great question about anime. I will tell a story. So porn is not just videos of in real life people having intercourse. Anime, I had my first porn conversation with my youngest kid when he was 10, and I did the like, have you ever heard the word porn? Oh yeah, I know it's like bad, but I don't know what it is. So we had a conversation. It's for adults. It's not for kids. It's not real. I talked about the body image stuff and how people are cast because of the size of their breasts or the size of their penises, and that they remove all their body hair and they bleach every orifice. He didn't know what orifice was, so I had to define that. And blah, 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 blah. And then a few days later, he said, Mom, I think that my anime is porn. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, why do you say that? And he started to explain like people's clothing getting blown off and people literally reading pornographic magazines in his anime. And so again, like it comes in all forms and shapes and sizes. And part of what we're trying to help kids do is become critics of the culture and content and media that they consume so that they can turn around and be like he turned to me and was like, why is it always the women's clothes that are getting blown off in my anime? Why isn't ever the men's clothes? And I was like, that's a great question. And while I wanted to launch into a 3-hour diatribe about misogyny and the patriarchy, I was like, self-control. Okay. Why do you think it's getting blown off? Right. You answer a question with a question. And this was like, he never had his first crush. He'd been locked down for 2 years. Like he hadn't even really socialized with other kids. Like anime and manga, that was his whole life, his whole reality. And even there was porn. So start with a simple question, get curious, tell them they can always come to you if they see anything or someone shows something, that you're not going to freak out, even if inside you're screaming in your own head. Make sure they know they are safe to come and ask you, because they won't just see it once. They won't just be exposed once. It's an ongoing thing. So just leaving the door open for that conversation.
Awesome. I'm going to get to Krista's question. I know, Brandy, yours came first, but because it's still on this topic, Krista's asking, how do we have conversations about sex, about how sex can be good and affirming, and still address that porn is out there, not reflective of what positive, empowering approach to sex is?
So that is the most important framing of the whole conversation, right? Our goal is for our kids to be in one day in healthy, loving, and if they choose, sexually gratifying and pleasurable relationships. Like by demonizing sex, and I've taught sex ed in classrooms for years and years and years, that when you demonize sex and when you do fear-based sex ed, all that does is it shuts down the conversation, and it does not delay sex for sex. It does not make their choices around sex any safer. It just makes you look reactionary and antiquated to them. And so setting up the conversation, especially when it comes to porn, by saying, listen, you're young for this conversation, but this is the world we live in and everything is online. So I'm going to start this conversation with you now. And then we're going to have it lots of times over many years. One day, you're going to want to be in a sexual relationship, and I'm going to want that relationship to be really wonderful and warm and happy and positive for you. That is what the adults in your life who love you want for you. What you see in free porn, and we should be clear with this group that there's free porn and then there's porn behind a paywall. And there are people who are trying to create porn that is not violent, misogynistic, aggressive, non-consensual. But the free porn that is being delivered to our kids is all of those things. So that's how you're speaking to it. But to say to them that what you might stumble across, what half of all 12-year-olds happen to see, is a type of sex that is not the type of sex that anyone hopes for you. So we're going to have lots of conversation. As Vanessa says, when she and I are on stage, Vanessa then does this thing where she's like, and then the kid's like, okay, thanks. And they walk out of the room. And it's true. Like that may be the first conversation, but just setting up this very clear expectation that sex is not a bad thing. You know, taking a major note from the Dutch and from other countries that do this really well, where they talk about sex and they talk about pleasure and they talk about connection and they talk about love. This is critical in terms of laying the groundwork. We've done a terrible job as a country because what we have talked about are STDs and STIs and rape and non-consensual sex. That is what we have focused on. And that does a real disservice. Not that those things should not be covered. Of course they should be covered. But there's a much bigger play here. And you will take lots of do-overs on the sex conversation, right? I mean, it's just rife.
Bella, like, we don't talk about love. And like, we don't talk to boys about love. I mean, not to gender this conversation, but it is gendered. Like we condition girls to like seek love and want love and all of that. And yet we don't talk to boys about love. We talk to boys about other aspects, hopefully about consent and respect. And those are all really important. But when you're thinking about love and you're thinking about like your partner's pleasure and their feelings and the meaning of like what it means to be connected to someone else physically and emotionally, like then the other stuff kind of gets pushed out of the way when that becomes the goal of interaction and relationship, which is not to say that people are not having lots of sex and lots of relationships simply because it feels physically good. Like we also have to remember to talk about pleasure to all people with all body parts deserve to know about pleasure. But Krista, to get back to your question, I think it's like holding those things in with both hands and saying like, hey, we get it. You're going to hear from people that like sex is bad or you shouldn't do it or whatever. And really you're saying sex is great and beautiful. And when you get older, we hope it's something that's a meaningful part of your life. And some people represent sex in ways that is like not respectful and not beautiful and not the way I would want you to have it. And again, that's not a conversation with a 10-year-old, right? That's the conversation. If you think of all these conversations like a spiral with increasing sophistication, that's where you get. Bella, there's a question about kids who don't want to.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go next.
Discuss. And we get this question in every talk we have ever done over decades, right? It's like, what about the kid who doesn't want to talk?
What about my kid?
Like Cara's kid, for example. So not every kid is going to want to engage. It's not always going to be like a kumbaya moment where they're like, Mom, I love you so much. And you're like, I love you too. And aren't we just so connected? Like sometimes you just have to give them information and then say like, any questions, right? That may be, if they're in the room, they can still hear you. Even if their body language is like arms crossed and like hoodie up and they're like completely turned away and you see like one sliver of their face, they're still there, they're still listening. And it's our responsibility to give them information, even if they're not having a super engaged reaction to it. So start small, start with something simple and something that feels easier to use, so that when they kind of push back or reject you, you haven't like put yourself out there and taken such a great risk, but make moments, little moments to have these conversations. Sorry, Bella, let me let you, I'm so used to moderating the chat that I'm like,
No, go. We're looking at
no,
the
no,
same
no,
thing.
go.
So Kathy's asking, I love the phrase, and coming off an eye-opening Halloween. How do you talk to your kid about their clothing choices without shaming, without shutting down? And I think that this also, it goes into the parts of the book where we're talking about body, where we're talking about hair, where we're talking about all these different things. And then when we're talking about friends, right? Because if the peer group is doing something or culturally it's appropriate, like how are you having conversations with young people specifically to this question, but then also broadly?
It's very hard. And I think that's great framing, like sexy Shrek or whatever. And it's like, really, what costume is not sexified at this point? And it's really hard. And I think, again, every parent is going to have a different value system around this. So even Vanessa and I don't necessarily have the same advice for our kids. I live in LA. My kids go to a school, my youngest is still there, a high school. It's very progressive, and their dress code is you can wear anything you want so long as it doesn't make your classmates uncomfortable. That's the dress code. Like, that is very, left coast. But that said, I think the way into these conversations is really the why behind the rules that you are setting. And the rules that you are setting are going to shift over time. They're going to depend upon what your kid's body is doing at any given point. Does their body look really developed? And are you worried about people sexualizing them because now they're embracing a more sexualized, whether it's crop tops or, push-up bras, or, guys have their own version of these clothes that show everything, right? And is that your issue? And if it is, to explain why and to tell your kids, I am reacting to what you're wearing, not because I don't think you're beautiful and your body's, you're growing beautifully and all these good things, but my worry is that it invites sexualization and it invites comments or thoughts from other people that you're not thinking about. That may be what your rationale is, and then you may set a set of limits there. Different families feel differently about this. This is a hard one because this is a conversation that immediately, in my experience with my own kids and also talking to teenagers for years, it immediately shames other kids when you set a limit in your own home. So if you say no crop tops for you because X and Y and Z, and we had an intern who talked a lot about this. Her mom never let her wear a tank top until she graduated from high school. Tank tops were not allowed in her home. And that was her, but her mom never explained the rationale. She knew, she was clear on it, but her mom never explained it. And she felt that her mom was then judging of course, 100% of her friends wore tank tops. And she felt that her mom was judging all of her friends. So opening up the conversation to explain your rationale is really important. I will say one of the corollary questions we often get is about bikinis. And I'm just going to say my pediatrician piece on bikinis. When kids hit a certain physical developmental stage and they are budding breasts and they are in one-piece bathing suits, you can see everything. It is in many ways, parents will come and they will say, how is this any less revealing than a bikini? Because these one pieces really do not, if that's the goal is not achieved. And I find that fascinating. And I find the kids often have a really great solution because they don't want, at that stage in their development, they don't want the world looking at their developing bodies. SNL had a skit decades ago where women evolved to have eyeballs on their instead of nipples, they had eyeballs. I don't know if you guys ever saw that, but it was amazing. It was like, it spoke to exactly what the issue is, right? So kids, when asked, will help problem solve around this. So that's my advice, is when it comes to clothing, it's a conversation with your rationale. You're setting the rules, right? You're the parent or you're the adult in the situation. But I think understanding your why is actually really important.
Yeah. Vanessa, were you gonna say anything?
I mean, the other thing about girls' clothes is like anyone's clothes. I mean, I had a knockdown, drag out fight with my 13-year-old this morning, and he came down in an outfit that I've told him 18 times he can't wear to school. And he, of course, tried it one more time. And I also think it's our right as parents to sometimes be like, yeah, this is my rule. Like, my rule in my house is no ass cheeks hanging out of your shorts. That's it. Right? Like, I'm not slut shaming you. This is my comfort level. I buy your clothes. This is my rule. No crop tops to school, no butt cheeks hanging out of your shorts, full stop. I don't need to explain it to you. Like, we give them bedtimes, right? We tell them what they can and can't eat for dinner. Like, there are certain things where we're just allowed to set a rule. But I see a comment in here, like, some people come from different cultures, right? So if you're parenting with another person and it's one person is comfortable with it and the other person isn't, that's a conversation to have amongst the adults, not in front of the kids, and come out with a unified position together and not litigate it in front of the kids. Kids who have trouble finding clothing that feels comfortable, that also seems appropriate, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work for the adults to help them find clothing that feels good, that looks appropriate, whatever appropriate means in your house. And all of those are conversations. I think if you can't find clothes that like are right for your kid, the list is actually a great place to email and be like, hey, I cannot find shorts that fit my growing kid. Or, I mean, somebody posted about bras, which is why I wrote in about umbras. But I think it is okay. You can still be like a feminist and a supportive parent and a parent open to stuff and set limits and be like, this is the rule in our house. Like, there you go. No more conversation.
We have 10 minutes left. I want to ask a very pointed question. How do you tell your kid that they stink? How do you navigate the BO question, the like, oh, you might want to start doing XYZ type of habit, you know, a period comes, how are we taking care of that, right? Like, how do you have these conversations with your kid about hygiene and that they're smelly and they need to take care of it?
Cara and I will have two different answers to this because we have two very different personalities. I would say something like this. I realized that I was never really specific with you about how to wash your body and take care of your body. Because the one thing that is universal is that somehow kids think that standing under running water without using soap will get rid of the smell and the bacteria. It is like a universal fact of kids. They need to be reminded very specifically to use soap under their arms, around their tush. They shouldn't use soap in their vaginas, but around the area of their groin. So remind them that they need soap. If you've reminded them they need soap like 5 times and they still come out of the shower and they still have like shocking BO, you can say, hey, I noticed that your armpits still smell even though you've used soap. Let's talk about deodorant. Let's talk about if you need a different soap. The sort of like, dude, you stink will definitely work on a percentage of certain kids, but it will also shame a large percentage of other kids. The place where, so like I have a kid where I can be like, dude, get back in the shower. You still stink. Soap under your arms. Like, do you need more soap? Blah, blah, blah. Other kids are really good at the dude, you stink. Like, this is a place where peer influence is very effective. If your kid is not brushing their teeth in the morning, if your kid is not using soap, if they have like that ring of dirt on their neck, even though they swear they have like been using soap and you're like, no, it's like I can see the dirt marching across your body. So peer influence is useful. And then Cara has like gentler, more subtle ways into the conversation. When I say to my older kids, like, do you need new face wash? They're like, Mom, you're being totally passive aggressive that I have zits. I have face wash. I'm using my face wash. Like, if you want to tell me I have zits, I'm perfectly aware that I have zits. But I'll let Cara offer up her more subtle diplomatic approach.
I'm actually not subtle. I'm exactly like Jessica and Laura in the chat. When it comes to smell, we laugh a lot. My son thinks he is the smelling gift to the universe. And so, a fart is like something that he leaves for us as a treasure, right? He is 18. He still feels this way. I'm like, really? This never ends. So telling him he smells is both jokey, but also completely ineffective because he has absolutely no problem with how he smells and he thinks it's totally fine. So I've gone the science route where I've just explained where BO comes from. We go through it in the book. It has to do with the bacteria on your skin, eating the oils in sweat. When you go into puberty, one of the things that shifts is the oil concentration in your sweat. That's why your feet smell. That's why your pits smell. That's why your groin smells. My husband got on board with this conversation when he drove a soccer carpool home in the rain and had to leave the windows up and thought he wasn't going to make it home because the 4 kids in the back, it was intolerable. So the car was soaking wet inside when he got home.
Yeah, I would just like, let it rain on me.
Windows down. Yeah. So, and that now Vanessa and I have products that we sell that are like smell-free socks to solve the foot problem, because you can shower twice a day and you still have horrible smelling feet at the end of a practice or whatnot. But I like the science path through it. I agree, just no shaming. Although 100% of all kids will claim that they have been shamed by their parents, no matter how you go about these things. So that's why the humor is helpful. Like, then they can turn it on you. Then they can say, you smell too. And you can have that very open, sweet back and forth where you're like, I totally smell and I'm getting in the shower, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. So I think there's a lot of that when it comes to things like smell, acne, zits, that's a big one, right? Kids don't want to be told, oh no, you have a pimple. Everyone they go to school with is pretty much covered with acne. This is the norm for them, but they don't like it. So how do you navigate it? How do you explain what's happening and problem solve?
Yeah. All right. I could ask you questions all day. You two are such a wealth of information. This book is a wealth of information. The where the sweat and BO came from, or where the BO comes from, was revelatory. So the science is in here. The heart is in here. The essays by 18 to 24-year-old at the end is so special and impactful. This book is gold. So please pick it up. Cara, Vanessa, thank you for putting it into the world. I hope it does exactly what you wanted to do and people buy it, and that we all have a more positive puberty experience for those in the future. Okay. Let me look at the chat. Just a bunch of thank yous.
All nice stuff. It's just all nice stuff, Abella. It's just all lovely. And I will just say, people, when to talk about sex before we jump off. I want to, Jessica, thank you for putting that back in. Okay. So we have this phrase we did not come up with. It's from a wonderful pediatrician named Trish Hutchinson, who's down in Charleston, who created a company called Girlology. And what she says, this is her rhyme: 8 is great, 9 is fine, and 10, it's time. So we're not talking about sex like how do you, right, talking about, when to talk about when to have sex. Okay, sorry, misunderstood that. So if the question is, we are not dictating our kids' sexual Yes, Jessica, 8 was young. Sorry, I misunderstood. Everyone should go. No. Okay. We're not dictating our kids' narrative about when. So when is not a number. Fun fact, American high schoolers are actually having vaginal penile intercourse later these days. But they're also having more oral and anal sex than they did a generation ago. So, interesting data. It's not about, it's not about when as an age. It's about when in terms of goals that you are setting for your kid in terms of the person that they're thinking about having sex with. Is the relationship respectful? Is it loving? Is it connected? Is it meaningful? Do they feel safe? Do they feel like their needs are met? Emotionally, in terms of communication, is this someone that they've been able to build a sense of trust with? So it's less about a number and more about milestones in terms of their connection. Now, that's in an ideal world, right? There are going to be lots of kids who are going to choose to have sex with someone who maybe they don't know that well, who maybe they're not in a trusted relationship with, who maybe they're not in a loving, meaningful, connected way with. So if that's the case, you also want to remember to talk about things like consent. Make sure that you're, what you're asking for or not asking for is being heard and met, that you feel comfortable with things that you are participating in. And when we grew up, the language was, no, I don't want to do that. Get off my body. But when you talk to young people, they'll say, I would never say that to anyone I was hooking up with. I would say something like, yeah, I'm not down with that. Or I got to go. My mom's coming to pick me up. Or oh, I just remember I told my friend I'd meet them downstairs. So they go for a much more oblique way of getting out of tough situations. And then it's about, do they understand their own bodies? Do they know what feels good to them? Do they feel good in their body? Do they feel like they have agency to ask for what they want, right? Like all of the things that go into feeling empowered and how we would want our kids to enter an intimate relationship. Those are the building blocks. And some kids come to that at one age, and some kids come to that at an age that's much, much older. So I hope that helps. I know it's a little bit subjective, but those are really the conversations we want to be beginning to have with kids who we think might be interested in. Yes, it's hard to leave behind how we grew up. We have a whole section in the book called Leave Your Baggage at the Door. And it's all about taking how our adolescence and how we grew up and leaving it outside the door when we go into conversations with kids, as hard as it is. I know we're at time. I should stop talking.
Yeah, though I'm so glad you answered that question, because I thought that was an absolutely beautiful answer.
The second I answered it the second time, the first time I answered the question. All I'll say is please feel free to get in touch with me via the list. If you have a question you didn't feel comfortable asking, if you want more resources, I can point you to amazing places. Please, please be in touch. We are so happy to be helpful, and hopefully you like the book and you get in touch with us and tell us what you thought.
My computer just like completely crashed. I don't know, everything crashed. So I want to say this was amazing. Abella, you are a phenomenal moderator, and everybody is going to want you to moderate everything, by the way. People are already in my DMs.
Well, Cara and Vanessa are just the best. So it's just like talking to some pals about sex.
Yeah, Cara, you are phenomenal. Please come join us on the list, and everybody buy this book. And I even put into the chat where to review the book on Amazon, so we can juice up your.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. This was such a lovely part of our tour.
Thank you all. Vanessa has said the best things about this group. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to rope you in, Cara.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.